Senator Singh.
I welcome the Australian Borderforce Amendment Protected Information Bill 2717 and the small step that it does take to increasing transparency within Australia's offshore detention centres. I have, though, been very much appalled by the Turnbull government's lack of transparency and its attempts to suppress whistleblowers and staff from highlighting significant concerns, instances of abuse and the mistreatment of asylum seekers on Manus Island and in Nauru. So whilst this bill will have the practical effect of narrowing the definition of information that is protected from disclosure, it does remove the broad definition of protected information and gives greater clarity as to what private information is actually protected. Labor, of course, supports this move for increasing transparency that we have been calling on for such a long period of time into Australia's onshore detention centres and offshore detention, immigration processing or detention centres. Of course, this bill means that individuals who've been involved in Australia's offshore detention system as contractors or employees of the Department of Immigration and Border Protection, such as Save the Children, social workers, psychologists, doctors and lawyers, will be able to speak more freely about their experiences without fear of prosecution, indeed without fear of up to 2 years' imprisonment. But the Turnbull government's mismanagement of offshore processing centres and welfare and support contracts has been, of course, already the subject of 2 scathing reports by the Australian National Audit Office. And both of those reports have clearly shown that greater transparency was needed. I have been contacted over and over by people who are angry, who are upset, and rightly so, as at the release of the Nauru files, where we remember 26 former Save the Children workers on Manus Island and Nauru detailed what they saw and described as allegations of sexual assault and self-harm in the Nauru detention centre. This was to women, it was to children, it was an absolute and utter disgrace. One of the workers stated, "You feel you can't talk about it even though you know you should talk about it." Indeed, if that is not in the public interest to hear the experience from these workers of what is happening in our name, in Australia's name, in these offshore detention facilities, then I don't know what is. The files, which the government shrouded in secrecy, included reports of genital mutilation against young women, people sewing their lips shut, self-immolation, sexual violence and gross mishandling of incidents by private contractors. That is what the government wanted to keep secret. That is what the government did not want the Australian public to know was happening. In 2016, in September, Labor initiated, off the back of this information and experience detailed by these workers, we initiated a Senate inquiry to investigate these allegations of abuse, of self-harm and neglect, because the Turnbull government had failed to act. The government's total inaction for the past 3 or 4 months nearly on the Chair's report, conclusions from that Senate inquiry and the recommendations is extremely appalling. It is extremely disappointing. Part of our democracy is to inquire and investigate through the Parliament, through the Senate committee process, these government failings, these issues, and the government needs to respond to the recommendations in that report, and it has failed so far to do so. So let's remember that this Australian Border Force Act has previously been used by the Abbott government to attempt to prosecute Save the Children workers after they revealed serious allegations of abuse of women and children. Here is workers on the ground, contracted by government to do a job, and when they experience and see firsthand what is going on in these government-funded, government-run immigration detention facilities, what does our government do when they report these serious allegations of abuse of women and children? What does our government do? It attempts to prosecute them. These workers were removed from the island and referred to the Australian Federal Police by Minister Morrison, the Minister for Immigration at that time, for allegedly breaching Section 70 of the Crimes Act. Now, I hope with this amendment that means that this can never happen again, that the work carried out by a non-government organisation contracted by government to do a job, and then they see abuse carried out, and instead of being able to report and be transparent and open about their work and their job and what they see, they are suppressed and in fact threatened by a government that says, well, you go ahead and do that and we will prosecute you. That is an absolute disgrace. That is shameful. And that is why Labor supports very much this amendment, to ensure that this can never happen again. But of course, beyond this bill, there are other things that this issue raises. This is a government that has systematically maligned asylum seekers and refugees and mismanaged offshore processing on Manus Island and Nauru. Indeed, there has not been any processing for the last 4 years. No one in this chamber, I am sure, can possibly regard that people who sought our asylum should still be on Manus Island and Nauru in these detention facilities now some 4 years on. The Prime Minister and the Immigration Minister have sat on their hands for too long in trying, or lack of trying, to explore every possible alternative than them being stuck and locked up on Manus Island and Nauru. So this bill is a good step in increasing transparency in our offshore detention system. I was very pleased to hear earlier this year when the government finally agreed that it would ratify the optional protocol against torture, which also requires more monitoring and investigation of what goes on in Australia's prisons and detention facilities. But I think what has been very clear to me is that whilst we have argued for this government to lift its game in this appalling policy area of immigration detention, we are not here alone. We stand here with the voice of our own communities. Indeed, in my community in Tasmania, they have always been an extremely outspoken one when it comes to the issues of refugees and asylum seekers. I've received hundreds and hundreds of letters protesting not only the conditions of Australia's offshore detention centres, but also, very much so, this secrecy that Australia's offshore detention regime has been shrouded in. And that is why this government has basically been dragged kicking and screaming to bring this amendment forward today, to backflip on its original position because of the lobbying by civil society, by the Labor Party, by people in our community who have said, this cannot go on. The issue of transparency and accountability in the work undertaken by these staff is critical to the trust and integrity that Australians have in our immigration and humanitarian programs. That is why this bill is so important, in that it tangibly means that individuals who've been involved in Australia's offshore detention system in any way, contractors, social workers, psychologists, department staff, doctors, you name it, will be able to speak more freely about their experiences and what they've seen, with less fear of prosecution. In winding back the government's total suppression of so-called whistleblowers and staff speaking out on Australia's offshore detention regime, this bill is a good thing, and it does highlight why independent monitoring is so important. Indeed, the chairperson of the UN Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture, Malcolm Evans, said, "This is why we think independent monitoring is so important. Transparency is one of the greatest protections here. Where there is a lack of transparency, naturally there will be concerns. Things are not as they ought." It pretty much is common sense. Hiding, shrouding a practice in secrecy means there must be something that the government wants to hide in the first place. So there have been a number of parts of civil society that I would like to acknowledge that have led to, of course, the government having to back down in its policy of secrecy. I would like to acknowledge the work of Save the Children, particularly for originally speaking out. The work of Guardian Australia in the release of the Nauru files. The work of the UNHCR, the ongoing important work of the UNHCR. And indeed other parts of community and society like Doctors for Refugees, the Refugee Council of Australia, so many NGOs working every day to help indeed rebuild the lives of refugees, people that have already suffered enough. Finally, I would like to recognise that there is critical work going on, not just in those particular facilities, but also here in Australia, for those that have been deemed refugees, have refugee status and have been able to settle. They are members of our community that work each day, volunteer, to make sure that we, as a country, do put humanity first and do act humanely to ensure that people can rebuild their lives after fleeing persecution, after the suffering that they've endured. I want Australia to be recognised as a welcoming, humane country for those people, right now, but also into the future. And the only way that can happen is if this sad and sorry chapter of the last 4 years of those who have been trapped on Manus Island and Nauru without any hope or any future for settlement in sight comes to an end. It is a failure of this government that they have not settled these asylum seekers and refugees. Shame on them. It's time that this ends. Let's hope this bill is only the beginning of that becoming a reality.